Hi class. So for this lecture, for chapter 5, remember we're skipping chapters 3 and 4 because they're boring. You don't want to deal with those. Chapter 5 is called Understanding Socialization, and so what we want to think about this chapter is really more along the lines of what we learned about social order and structural functionalism from the first two chapters. Obviously, when we think about socialization, there are some interactionist elements, thinking back to symbolic interactionism and what we've learned about that so far. When we think about gender, there's a little bit of conflict theory, but I think thinking about social order is probably the primary frame through which we want to think about with this chapter, at least the beginning sections that you've probably already started reading. And so we really want to start out thinking about how many ordinary things we do every day that are taught to us by others that we take for granted. Things that we, in some ways, almost think about or consider as innate, but things like our parents giving us a bedtime, our parents teaching us and then demanding that we brush our teeth, morning routines, taking a shower. So we think about showering as hygiene, obviously, but it's also about routine, but that also speaks to cultural ideas of cleanliness and what it means to be a hygienic person. That can vary across regions or countries, certainly varies across time. In 50 or 100 years, our ideas of hygiene will probably be different than what they are now, just as they are different now compared to 50 or 100 years ago. So all of these things, particularly things that keep us healthy and keep others healthy, like maybe brushing our teeth, are what we would call norms. Basic, reoccurring patterns of behavior and interaction that form a fundamental part of what we would call society or a society, thinking about how we have multiple societies within a broader global society. So from the time we were an infant, our family first and then our peers later really teach us a lot of what it is or what it means to be who we are. For example, there are cultural ideas based on tradition, but also nutrition, about what is a proper breakfast food, right? We kind of joke in our culture about like, oh, I had pizza for breakfast. It was in the fridge, it was left over, so you can eat it. It's food. In my case, it's sometimes the only food in my refrigerator. But we generally don't think of pizza as a breakfast food. We think of it as a really like a dinner food and also kind of like a celebrity or a celebratory food, something we do to celebrate with, like cake. So other things like punctuality, so time is something that keeps social order, and therefore being on time is something that shows you as being a responsible, productive citizen and a responsible and productive part of society. So all of these things that we do to start our day, that we do throughout the day, that we do multiple times within, say, 1 week or a month, are what we call socialization. And so socialization is a process of learning really what is normal and common in a society or culture. For students in this class from Asia who have been in America at UB, you're learning a lot of American norms and customs that you maybe didn't learn in your home country. If I were to go study in China or even France, but particularly a non-European country, non-English speaking country, I'd be learning a lot of different things, some of which might be very different to American culture. So this is how we establish norms, how we establish social patterns, and these are things that give life predictability. So functionalism and order is really about thinking about predictability. And so the outcome of this process of socialization is what in sociology we call social reproduction, which is the outcome. So, for example, think about maybe a tie, a dress tie, as a feature of men's formal fashion that shows they are a responsible, mature employee. That's a form of fashion that's over a half century or more old. So there's something about the classical look of a man in a tie or a woman in a particular type of business dress, like formal dress, so think like formal office attire, that has stayed as a norm over a long period of time. So societies have continuity over time because people internalize those values and those norms, and they pass them on to their children. They in some ways even kind of enforce them through policing other people like peers or subordinates, say if you're a boss in a workplace. If I'm maybe in an office cubicle and the guy next to me doesn't dress professional for work, I may say something to him and be like, hey Bob, you might want to dress a little more formal because, you definitely want to get promoted, certainly don't want to get fired, you want to look the part that you belong here. More contemporary example would be checking our smartphones for social media updates. That's now almost normal. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, constantly being on your phone was really considered rude, or maybe that you were distracted, whereas now it's really become more and more normal. So obviously new things, new technologies change norms, and sometimes very quickly. Think about the role that Facebook plays in our life. Facebook's only really maybe 15 years old, I think. It emerged when I was in college back in the early to mid 2000s, which means I'm dating myself for all of you right now, kind of embarrassingly. But think of how Facebook has really changed the nature of social life, the way people communicate, the way people identify with themselves in terms of how they project their self out to the world. And so occasionally we'll have a paradigm shift where norms can change, and sometimes very quickly. Kind of example of this is 200 years ago, people rarely ever bathed daily, only really, really rich people. Whereas now we think of bathing as just one of these things you're supposed to do, and if you don't do it often enough, we think you essentially haven't been socialized properly. So before I move on to things like maybe the life course, I'd to think about well, actually, hold that thought. I obviously know what I'm doing. These different things that we learn at different stages of life. So earlier I mentioned things we learn as infant through our family. Think about changes to your life that occurred when you went to college. If you're a traditional college student doing the normal thing of living in a dorm, living on campus, maybe living away from your parents for the first time, living on your own, living with roommates for the first time. This is a change where you become a new person, and these are different parts of the life course. So in anthropology, these are sometimes called rites of passage. So other key events during the life course that are part of the socialization process, particularly the socialization process to become an adult, are things like getting a driver's license, losing your virginity, your first major significant romantic relationship, getting married, living on your own for the first time, for any of you who are sports fans, maybe if you're playing hockey or soccer, let's say you turn professional, your first professional goal. I went to college on a soccer scholarship, and so for me, it was my first college yellow card because I was not a very well-behaved player. So you can think of rites of passage throughout your life course as key events that you're doing for the first time that kind of mark you as either an adult or as a legitimate part of that system, say like a sports team. For some of you, it may have been passing your first college exam, taking your first college exam, walking into your first college class, getting the grades from your first semester in college. So these are things that, these are gateways towards becoming an adult. Oh, a big one that I somehow forgot because I love drinking, is turning 21 in America and being able to drink legally for the first time. It's not necessarily as fun for some people as drinking under the age of 21, which I'm sure no one in this class has done, and I certainly did not do. But being able to go out to a bar and order a beer, being able to go to a liquor store and buying your first bottle of wine, that is considered a key part of becoming an adult. So if, like, for example, with Facebook earlier, that example, that's an example of what we would call resocialization. So Facebook and now Twitter. Before Facebook, it was MySpace. If any of you remember that. Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, thinking of social media, these are things that re-socialize us. And so we become socialized differently at some part of our life. Think of kind of the difference, say, learning about Facebook, learning to use it as a teenager when it first came out, early to mid-2000s. So I was in my early 20s maybe. Growing up with Facebook compared to it just emerging when you're a teenager, compared to it emerging when you're a young adult as a college student, compared to people using it for the first time, maybe they were in their 50s when Facebook came out. So people are learning to use this brand new technology in form of communication and interaction at different parts of their life course. And so now I'd like you, if you have a chance, I would really advise reading, and I may assign something from it potentially later in the class. Page 81, doing Sociology 5.1, Feral Children and Socialization. If there's anything I like teaching about in sociology, it's about feral kids. And so, feral children, this activity in the documentary, it lists, it's good for having us think about really how extensively we are socialized. And so this is part of the nature versus nurture debate. Not something I want to dig into too deeply, but in nature versus nurture are not oppositional. They're not oppositional viewpoints. These are things that really actually mutually reinforce each other. So on page 80, I'd recommend kind of reading the short section of nature versus nurture, but just know that compared to the biological sciences and sociology, we focus on the part of human existence that is shaped by social forces and socialization. So this isn't to discount the role of nature and biology, but just that we're focusing on social forces. And I think the Feral Children activity documentary really allows us to know the extent to which that happens. So now we're moving on to understanding theories of socialization. And so really with here, what we want to think about and this will be jumping ahead just a little bit, but the easiest way to teach Mead's theory of childhood development is to think about the family. So the family is our primary unit of socialization. That's where we mirror what parents or siblings are doing, other relatives who might be around often, like grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. And so we eventually begin to mirror them. And so that's why so often a child's first words is mama or dada, because that's something they're hearing around. It's how they're usually hearing a mother talk. A child is hearing a mother talk, saying something like come to mama. And so children mirror what they see, and the majority of the time, that's the nuclear family unit, or some type of primary family unit. And so self-consciousness, our self-concept, kind of having this interior self where we hear our own voice in our own head, that is something that is learned through learning language. Not something that's not something innate according to sociology, particularly according to these early major theorists like Charles Horton Cooley that you're looking at on page 81. These are largely things we learn through the language learning process. So for example, as infants become toddlers, we learn to take the role of the other. And so young children, often girls, but sometimes boys, so often want a baby doll of their own because they are mirroring what they see their parents doing with them. So this is what's called taking on the role of the other. So much of socialization is mirroring and imitating what we see the more powerful authority figures around us doing. And so then eventually we learn to, and as we become older children, say like closer to 5, in that 3 to 5 range, we start anticipating others' behaviors. So we start to learn to say, oh, dad's coming home, better get my room clean because I want dessert after dinner. So we start to learn and internalize the norms and proactively respond to them rather than just reacting and responding to them. So an example of this can be the first time children play baseball, sometimes as little as like 4 and 5 years old. You start to anticipate the ball being hit to you. You're anticipating someone throwing the ball to you. And so you're learning to respond proactively to what is happening around you as what in sociology we would call an agent or an actor, in terms of acting with agency. So we can think of this a little bit as the extent to which we can act with free will. And so that's an example of how, say, parents are what we call agents of socialization. And they're usually our form of primary socialization. And so I talked about the family a lot. After the family, obviously it's the school system. And it's in the school system that we learn to see other people as authority figures, namely our teachers, as important authority figures separate and apart from our parents. It's then we learn the ideas of peers, and we start to learn from and mirror and imitate our peers. And so this is important, even if you are, say, a twin and you have a sibling your exact age, a school mate, who's maybe your friend, maybe not, maybe they're just a schoolmate. That's a different type of relationship than, say, your brother or sister, even if they're the same age. And so that's where we start to differentiate from the family unit. And so our self-concept is then partially based on the relationships we have with other people, and those are our classmates. And thinking in terms of socialization, the school system is also where we have major social and cultural transmission of values. So think about, the types of behaviors and values you learn going to a wealthy suburban school compared to maybe a poorer rural or urban school. So a lot of you talked about where you grew up in your first discussion board posts. And some of you talked about maybe growing up in a wealthier suburb compared to maybe a wealthy suburb that's predominantly white compared to really an ethnically diverse place, and all of the different social and cultural norms that come along with those differences. At a young age, particularly as we get older, then the media becomes a major agent of socialization. So think of all the things we learn from media. And so by media, we don't just mean news media, which is kind of the common usage of that term. When we think of media, we can think of any form of written or spoken text to which we are exposed. So children's books are media. Books generally are media. So by media, we can think of it as texts. Anything written or spoken to which you are exposed. So obviously children's books are a major one. But then obviously we get to a certain age, we start watching cartoons. And we may not think of visual media like a cartoon as a text, but think of it this way. On a computer, you could turn the video off and just listen to it. You can put the closed captioning on and be able to read it while you're listening to it. So texts, particularly when we think about media as a socializing agent institution, really encompasses any major kind of textual thing we're exposed to. When we're adults, that becomes things like sitcoms, the news, obviously movies. And so thinking back to functionalism, the family, education, and the media, all of which are codified in law in some way. So usually, if you want to think about if something is an institution or not, think of it if there are laws for it. Because law is our kind of major institution. In a more indirect way, the law socializes us. It's not really touched on in this chapter. But the law is a socializing agent because it teaches us ideas about right from wrong and what the punishments for certain kinds of behavior might be. But think about prison or the military as examples of total institutions. And so total institutions are ones where your sleep, work, and play all incur the confines of that institution. So think of it in some ways as if you were a child on house arrest and you couldn't leave your house. You didn't leave your house for months or even years on end. Think of it as being grounded perpetually, forever, for your childhood. In which case, the family unit would then be an example of a total institution, somewhat like a prison or a military system. Those of you who grew up in or know of children with incredibly controlling kind of helicopter type parents who really controlled everything their children witnessed, experienced, observed, who they interact with. So really over-the-top controlling parents in a very dark, somewhat comedic, but kind of dark view, you could think of as overly authoritarian parents as creating a total institution. Hopefully I'm not making any of you reflect on your childhoods too much and causing you to have a nervous breakdown. It might just mean you need to talk to your parents a little less and be a little more independent, hopefully. So after that dark note, which is what I'm known for as an instructor, I like to get dark and twisty with it. I'm not going to talk about this too much. I think so in the additional material in the folder for Chapter 5 on UV Learns, I posted some additional material on gender socialization, and so I would suggest checking that out. So I'll leave the gender part of this chapter as something for you to kind of teach yourself and explore yourself. Largely also because we have a chapter on gender, and so I don't want to be exposing you with all of the same information too much, too often. But to give you an idea about socialization, think about, in action movies, we often get ideas of what masculine men are supposed to be. Incredibly large, strong, very emotionally stoic, brave, aggressive, not showing a lot of vulnerability. Think of the extent to which media, particularly movies, normalize women wearing makeup, and sometimes a lot of makeup, and how how women are supposed to look. How women are supposed to look is really, in some ways, a very kind of concocted, calculated appearance that takes a lot of preparation. Not that there's anything wrong with wearing makeup, because there's not, and some men wear makeup and do a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's escaping me. Not landscaping, not pruning. Men take care of themselves a lot too, and care about their appearance too. Maybe not necessarily in makeup, but many of guys get their eyebrow waxed. I get mine waxed. So appearance is, incredibly important to men too, just in different ways. So when these things are expectations and you're kind of punished for not abiding by them, then we start thinking about how people are not just socialized, but also socially coerced. What else do we got? And so, not looking masculine or not looking feminine. Let's say you have a queer identity and you play with gender, something we'll talk about in the gender chapter. Potentially, we can experience some role strain and role conflict. Competing demands, say, maybe I want to dress very feminine. Maybe I identify as trans. My parents are very against that. That's what in sociology we would be experiencing role strain. When multiple parties or one party and ourselves, our own wishes, are kind of divided over who we can be. When these social roles conflict with each other, when you're literally not able to be two different people or more than two people, then that's called role conflict. Say like when you're a parent, maybe it's to stay at home and take care of your sick child, but your boss will not let you take off of work. Maybe you get fired. So you can either be a bad employee, or you can be a bad parent, but you can't. And in that moment, you really can't be both a good employee and a good parent. And so that's where we experience what's called role conflict. And so it obviously has professional implications, but also personal ones. The last part of this chapter, it's worth coming back to. So the chapter ends having us think about Goffman again. So into chapter 2, we talked about Goffman. And that's this idea of performance of self. So like you notice, with the shaggy mane of hair, during these videos, I'm continually putting my hands in my hair because I don't want to look like a total slob to you people. It's also something I do when I'm slightly nervous. Not that I'm nervous giving you a video lecture, but I am kind of, you get that slightly nervous, kind of anxious energy because you're performing, trying to do a good job, trying to be funny to keep your attention. I'm not trying to be too stupid, so I keep you engaged in the class. But, kind of fidgeting and doing something with our hands, something we do when we're nervous. And so that is what Goffman would call not great impression management. So remember in chapter 2, I taught you about the front stage compared to the back stage. Teaching an online class, I'm fairly laid back. I give video lectures in t-shirts. This is a t-shirt from Patagonia. For those of you who are familiar with outdoor stuff, there's a telescope on it. But when I teach in class, I wear a tie, I wear a suit jacket, I wear suit vests, cardigans, tweed trousers. So when I am teaching in the classroom at UB, I take my presentation of self very seriously. And to think a little bit deeper about what Goffman calls the front stage or the backstage, think of the front stage as like if you're working in a restaurant and you're with your table as a server, you're a server or a bartender. And you have some guests who are just impossible to deal with and they're driving you crazy. And you just want them to leave. You go in the kitchen and you look at the cook and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for table 2 to leave. They're driving me crazy. These are horrible people. And those people hear you because the door of the kitchen was left over. So that's where the backstage gets kind of interrupted by the front stage, or the backstage is bleeding into the front stage by accident. Think of it as when children accidentally listen in and hear a conversation their parents having that their parents don't want them to know about. And so this is what Goffman calls the presentation of self, or the performance of self. And Goffman also tells us that who we are is largely a product of how we think others view us, more than who we think we are ourselves, which is why the socialization process is so vital. Sorry, I've already been going for over half an hour. Trying to not torture you too much. So those are all the key points of this chapter. All the other material for this chapter is up there. Discussion, today's the 16th. Discussion board for this chapter is due the 19th. Writing assignment number 1 due 2 days later, 21st. Got questions about that stuff, let me know. Enjoy this lecture. Hopefully it fleshes some things out for you. And if you have any questions, let me know via email. And I'll talk to you again soon for our next chapter, which is identifying deviant behavior. I feel like in my video lectures, I already act pretty deviant. That's a fun chapter to teach, I think. So we'll be dealing with that soon. And enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.